So tonight, we're going to be going into Genesis chapter 12 and 13 together. But first, I want to do a little bit from Genesis chapter 11 because the bell called us and we didn't really get a whole lot of time to discuss the actual situation of the Tower of Babel and the building of that and different points of application which we are going to be able to draw. So we were discussing how that from this juncture is where we're going to have the rest of the Old Testament unfold for us. The nations that we're going to run into as Abram is traveling about through the land of Canaan, going into the time frame of Moses and the giving of the law, the establishment of the kingdoms. All of that is finding its origins in chapters 10 and 11. Now, what has ultimately pushed that is the rebellion that takes place towards the end of chapter 11. In Genesis chapter 11, verse 9, beginning, well, actually, let's look at... Notice this in Genesis chapter 10, 8 through 10. And Cush begat Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. So here we have, again, in Genesis chapter 9, 11, Babel is being mentioned once again for us in this context. We have the establishment of it, and that is being brought up as a kingdom. Possibly, we have here indication of the effort to establish a world empire. You have all of these people that are still in this one location, Genesis chapter 11, verse 4. They said, "Go to, let us build us a city and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." So there's their thinking on the matter. Here we all are. The world has been destroyed. Everyone else has been wiped out because of the flood. Now we're here. What are we going to do? Well, they knew about the people that were before the flood. You have Cain's line, Lamech, and the different ones, and what were they involved in doing? They were involved in the processes of building cities, and they would have seen what it was they were able to produce. So they're gone. What are we going to do? It's created a vacuum. Well, let's start building up like they were going to build up. But we know that that's not what God had, in fact, intended. When Noah and his family came off the ark, what was it that God said to them? All right, be fruitful, multiply, replenish the earth. Spread out. Start again. But now what are they wanting to do? Stay in one place. Let's make a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. Now, is there not strength in numbers? Is that not the idea? Well, let's stay together. And if we stay together, we won't have to worry about anything that ends up happening again like it did before the flood. And it's interesting how that oftentimes when it comes to these situations, and we're getting glimpses as we're going through and kind of doing these character studies and we're noticing these groups, we're getting a bit of insight into human makeup. I'm the type of person that I have the tendency of seeing something that needs to be done and I'll do it. But you come along and ask me to do it, you kind of ruin a bit of my incentive. I don't know what it is about me. And I know there are others that have that same quality. It's just a thing, well, I was going to do it before you even asked. But now that you've asked, I don't want to do it. And it's almost like there's a little of that going on here. They're being told, go out, spread out, scatter. Well, now that we're being told that, don't really know necessarily that we want to do that. And how often that same mentality it goes on throughout time. So not only that, as we've already said, we've already seen this before. Genesis chapter 4 and verse 17, Cain knew his wife, she conceived and bare Enoch, and Enoch builded a city, called the name of the city after the name of his son Enoch. Let's make us a name. Let's not scatter out. Let's stay together so that we can be strong. What's the root of this? Genesis chapter 11, verses 5 and 6. The Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of men builded. And the Lord said, Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language. And this they begin to do. And now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. Now there are several interesting points just from these two verses. Number one, just consider what's being said there in verse 5. The Lord came down to see the city. and the tower which the children of men builded. Does God really need to come down and see these things out? No, God is in heaven, God is above, and God is able to see all. Everything is naked before his eye. So why this description? Do we not oftentimes have the tendency to think that God is miles and miles away? But what do these descriptions do? It brings him closer, does it not? And it shows involvement. That's something that we've been trying to establish throughout our studies as well. God is involved in the affairs of the earth. And what a time right now that we need to be brought in remembrance of that. There's a lot of controversy going on right now within our country. What do we need to remember? God's in control. God is involved. And we have to be wise and strive to make the best decisions as his people to be able to move forward no matter what ends up happening. We're not going to have direct revelation so as to tell us, well, here's what you need to do. Get up, come out of your family's house and go into a land which I've promised you. We're not going to have that. So we need to make sure that we are able to go back into God's Word, study different situations, note these things, and be able to make application. Here are some things that are similar to this account in the Scriptures. Here's how they handled it. Here's how they went about it. So there's that in verse 5, but then also in verse 6. The Lord said, behold, the people is one. That doesn't sound too bad. They all have one language, and this they begin to do. And now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. Now, where have we heard that before? Genesis 6. What was the problem that ended up bringing the flood? Sin. You're on it. You're on the right track. Every imagination was on evil continually. Now, our imaginations, if they're put to good use, can really be a wonderful thing. When we start trying to consider, well, what can we do within the realms of the kingdom? And striving to push its borders. Well, let's think outside the box a little bit. Let's use our imagination. All right, that's a good thing. But when your imagination actually ends up putting you in a position where you're in opposition to what it is that God has already said, now we're getting into the realm of problem, into trouble. And that's what's going on here. They've heard what God has already said, be fruitful and multiply, replenish the earth. Well, if we're going to do that, we've got to spread out. Now their imagination is saying, well, no, we're not necessarily wanting to do that. We stay one, we stay together, and we'll be able to bring these things about. So as Brother Brody said, Genesis chapter 6, you have that mentioning of the imagination. The thoughts of their hearts was on evil continually. God said, replenish the earth. And what are the people imagining? No, let's stay together and let's build a name. Let's make something of ourselves. And then also in verse 6, how that the phrase is inserted here, and now nothing will be restrained from them. The very concept that you have the inklings of mob mentality. Here we are, one together. So whatever we decide to put our minds to do, well, we have the backing of the majority. We have the backing of the people. So let's do it. And God is realizing, okay, here's a problem. Now, do we not face similar problems today? You have individuals that they lick that finger and stick it to the wind, and they'll try to figure out, well, where's the majority going? And when that type of mentality comes in, nothing's able to be restrained, if that's how everything's going to operate. But we've got to be able to stand against those type of mentalities and those thinkings, so as to be able to bring about what God has actually said. And it brings a reminder of what the situation with Gideon was. In Judges chapter 7, you have Gideon and his army, and God has to wean down the people. Why is that? The Lord said unto Gideon, the people are yet too many. Too many people, and you start relying on your own strength. And thus that's what they're doing here. We've got all these people. What can we imagine? What can we put together? We're strong together. So what about our need of God? We don't have so much need of God if we've got the numbers. Now, and what's even scarier about this situation is that I'm pretty sure I'd have to as far as my memory goes, and it's pretty shaky right now, Noah would still be alive at this point. Now, how about that? Here, you've already seen the world be wiped out because of imagination. And within a few generations, what's the world doing again? Now, brethren, that's a scary thought as to how quickly things can turn badly, even with people that are striving to do their very best. So here's man once again being found in rebellion, pride, sin, causing further division. Genesis 11, verse 8 through 9. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. Therefore is the name of the city of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth. All right? You wouldn't go out as I asked you to go out. You went against my will. So I'm going to bring this about so as to make you scatter. Now, we end up seeing a similar situation when we get over to the New Testament, do we not? What about when the church was first being established? Did they not have a commission and a command from the Son of God to go out and to preach to all nations, to the whole world? And to a large degree, what had to happen so as to get that ball rolling? All right, they had to be scattered. And that by persecution. Persecution comes and scatters the congregation, scatters the church in Jerusalem, and they take the word out. We need to make sure that we do our very best to follow these commissions. And so, as we said, we need to remember from this section that this is where the Gentile nations are coming from. And what we're also needing to consider is the outlook of God in these chapters on all of these people, because of where we're fixing to go. Genesis chapter 12, we're going to be introduced to Abram. Abram's going to come out of his father's house, out of the land of Ur. He's going to be chosen so as to bring about a separate nation. Now, that's an interesting point as well. We do not have Israel being mentioned in this section, because Israel is not being established, is not being built like these other nations are. The nation of Israel is being built differently. But when we're considering God over all these people, God is in fact a universal God. When they are all here and when they all scatter, God is over them. So when we get into the chapters where it starts discussing the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, what are we also needing to remember? He's also the God over these nations, even though they end up rejecting him and refusing further to follow his will. So God is going to be over all of these families, not just over Shem's. And the development of the nation of Israel should not lead us to believe that God just forgot about all of these people. And we know that's not the case from what we have in Genesis chapter 12, as we're going to note in just a moment. I will bless them that bless thee, curse him that curse thee, and in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. But as we go through Israel's history, will not the nation of Israel forget this point? Will they not begin to see themselves as being superior and as being over all these different nations? Now, to a degree, in an aspect, were they not superior? Well, yes. You're being given the law of God. You are his people. You have these blessings. But what were they supposed to do? They were supposed to be a reminder and a witness to all these other nations. You know who this God is. We've all come from the same place. So to think that God forgot about these nations or these families until this point, or until the Messiah ends up coming in the New Testament, is just not so. And it'll also do us well to remember what will be said in Zephaniah chapter 3 and verse 9. Here we have languages being developed. The language is being confused and the people are being scattered out. Well, in Zephaniah's day, we have a prophecy being made, for then will I turn to the people a pure language, that they may all call upon the name of the Lord to serve him with one consent. So here God is, and he's spreading them out by confusing the language. But what is it that's going to bring them back together? What is it that's going to unite? all these nations and all these peoples. And Zephaniah, it's described as being a pure language. That's going to end up being the gospel. And you have that being done in Acts chapter 2. The gospel is the only way unity can be restored at this point, to bridge the separation that sin has actually produced. In Acts chapter 2, verses 7 and 8, they were all amazed and marveled, saying one to another, Behold, are not all these which speak Galileans? And how hear we every man in our own tongue wherein we were born? So here we are, we're reading about the scattering of the nations. Well, how are all these people going to be brought back together? What is the only thing that can bring all ethnicities, all classes, and all types of people together? It can only be the gospel. I can remember being at a debate in Arkansas, and I was there with a preacher from Alabama, and actually it was two preachers from Alabama, and my family was there, and my dad wears a cowboy hat, and a few others were there. And we were just standing around chatting. And one of the preachers from Alabama just was looking at the circle that was there and just all the misfits that were there in the circle. And he just said, the only thing that could bring a group like this together is the gospel. And so when we're looking at this section, we are certainly in a blessed position to be where we are, that we're able to see the full scope and the overreaching arch as to what's going to take place. And really to see the brilliance and the genius of the God in which we serve. To be at this point and have everybody scattered out, but then have everything come together just as it's supposed to, with the coming of His Son and the sacrifice and the bringing forth of the gospel. So that's Genesis chapter 11. Any thoughts or comments before we shift quickly over to chapter 12? All right. Going once, going twice. All right, Genesis chapter 12. In entering Genesis chapter 12, we are being reintroduced into what the Bible is all about and what the goal of man ultimately is. What is man's greatest concern? And that is, how is God going to bring us back together? The scheme of redemption. But that's going to be found by the birth of a nation. Now, in considering this from the standpoint of just a casual reading, we might actually think that God is trying to maybe rush us through so as to get into this material. Because in 11 chapters, from Adam to the time frame of the flood, and them coming out of the ark and things of that nature, you're looking at a time frame about 1,650 years roughly to the flood. And about another 350 years to the time frame in which Noah dies. So about 2,000 or so years in 11 chapters. That's a lot of information. That's a lot of time. And a short amount of reading. But from here, we're going to end up reading about Abram, Lot, Sarah, Isaac. We're going to end up reading about Abram and Abraham in 14 chapters. So here we are, and we're covering a lot of ground in a short amount of chapters. And now all of a sudden we're dealing with this one character for 14 chapters. You think that's important? I would say that's an important topic if we're looking at it for 14 chapters. This is an important section of history. And so as we study Abraham, we're going to find the fundamentals, the basic principles of redemption being placed for us in seed form. And these principles are going to be planted here that will develop and grow into principles of redemption that are going to be found in the New Testament. And so we need to consider this section very carefully as to what's being described and what's going on with these different characters and how God's involvement is being shown to us. And so if people hope to understand God's plan, you cannot just read through this section. You're going to have to take your time and consider some points. And one of the first things I would like for us to consider is to consider how Abraham is referred. In Isaiah chapter 41 and verse 8, you have the scriptures, Isaiah stating of Abraham, or speaking to the people at that time. He says, "But thou, Israel, art my servant, Jacob whom I have chosen, the seed of Abraham, my friend." In 2 Chronicles chapter 20 and verse 7, art not thou our God, who didst drive out the inhabitants of this land before thy people Israel, and gavest it to the seed of Abraham, thy friend, forever? And then in James chapter 2 and verse 23, and the scripture was fulfilled which saith, Abraham believed God, and it was imputed unto him for righteousness, and he was called the friend of God. Now, brethren, we've already seen God's wrath towards sin, and we've seen to a large degree his mercy when it came to Noah and his family. And a lot of individuals, when they pick up the Bible, they want to hone in and they want to focus in on the flood and just say, how can you serve a God who would do something they would view as being so cruel? Well, it's just the situation at the time. And as we've already said, they're not looking at it from the right perspective. So we end up shifting from God's wrath towards sin to now, here's Abraham. And when it comes to the life of Abraham, it is almost like God is taking Abraham by the hand and just leading him through step by step almost. And this man that God placed the promise of redemption upon is called God's friend. Now, brethren, right here we have the background of God's grace and redemption. To call out this man, to have this man be obedient, to be brought in. And when we're discussing the idea of friendship, that's closeness. Now, we live in a day and age where everybody is caught up on this idea about, well, my personal relationship with God. And to a large degree, I hate what they have done to that idea, because oftentimes denominationalists, they pick up these ideas and we then start drifting away from them just because it brings up denominational tendencies. But when we're considering relationship that we're supposed to have with God, we are supposed to have a relationship with God. It's just not the type of relationship that most denominational people talk about. And with Abraham, he had a relationship with God. He's called his friend. Now, do we just let anybody be our friend? No, this is a special place. And then to consider that you're being called, your friend is God? That just amazes me. But not only does it amaze me, but it gives me hope. That if Abraham could be God's friend, why not me? Why not us as we sit here this evening? Now, of course, yes. Right, yes. That's right. And that's the thing with Abraham. As Brother Kerry's mentioning, John 14:15, you'll be my friend. Sorry, flip it, 15:14. You'll be my friend if you do that which I command you. Well, what about Abraham? We know from Hebrews chapter 11, Abraham walked by faith, doing those things which God had commanded him. So how does he gain this title? How does he gain this closeness? By being obedient. Now, is it perfect obedience? No, we know it's not perfect obedience. We're going to see that in this chapter. But in fact, also we have here, so here we have this phrase 3 times mentioned as being the friend of God. It shows God's care, it shows God's concern, and it shows God's interest in man, even though man may be involved in sin. And I inserted maybe. We can mark it down at some point or another. We are going to be involved in sin. And so what do we need to remember? Does God become an enemy when I commit sin? Now, it depends on how I treat that sin. If I'm a person who committed sin, that is, I'm letting sin reign, I've moved over into another camp. But if I, in being a child of God, end up committing sin, I slip into it, I'm entrapped, I'm snared, what have you. Just a couple of chapters ago, we're reading about Noah, and he's drunk. And what did we try to do for Noah? We try to give him mercy, we try to give him room, we try to give him understanding. Now, why don't we do that for ourselves? Now, I understand we can get carried away with that. But when I commit sin, what do I need to remember? God's my friend. And I do not need to run away from my friend. I instead need to run towards my friend. And so this, in fact, is going to be the background of John 3:16. God so loved the world. Well, how do we know that? Look at Abraham. He's God's friend. Abraham is God's friend. It's a reminder of God's love for his people. Also, consider this. We know, we've read about God's attitude towards sin and how he cannot overlook sin. We saw that with the flood. Yet it's interesting that the solution to sin and this closeness that's being produced, this closeness is produced when the solution to sin is revealed. All right, Abraham, here's how sin is going to be dealt with. When man obeys that revelation, then we have that relationship where God and man become friends. And that's an important point to consider and to learn from this section, because how are we going to be God's friend today? Well, it's going to be through the same means in which Abraham was God's friend. Now, the details are going to be different. I don't have to leave my father's house and travel into a land that I do not know about, even though I'm, interestingly enough, I'm getting pretty close to that. And I don't have to go up on a mount and offer my firstborn son. So the details aren't the same. But do I still not have responsibilities that I'm supposed to meet and fulfill so as to be obedient to God's commands and thus be called his friend? Absolutely. So seeing this early in these readings, it will help to remove a false concept about God. And I've already touched on it, kind of got ahead of myself. The idea that God is over us and watching us and waiting to jump down our throat at any minute. And there are a lot of brethren that live their lives that way, as though God is just sitting in heaven and he's got his thumb over a red button waiting for you to mess up so he can send you to hell. That's not the God we serve. God wants to be our friend. And to have that type of idea creates the wrong idea about religion. And even Jesus dealt with that during his day and age. You take, for instance, the one-talent man. He failed to recognize the type of God that Abraham actually served. What was the problem that the one-talent man had? We know that he hid his money in the ground, but why did he do it? All right, both of you said it. He was afraid. Now, why was he afraid? Okay, Brother Samuel said just. What did you say? Okay, Matthew 25:24. Then he which had received the one talent came and said, Lord, I knew thee that thou art an hard man, reaping where thou hast not sown, and gathering where thou hast not strawed, and I was afraid, and went and hid thy talent in the earth. Now, where did he read that? Where did he get that idea? Now, I understand that there is a severity to God. Paul said that. But what about his severity? Is there not another side? Is there not goodness? And my actions, my lifestyle, is what determines what I end up facing. But this gentleman here, with the illustration that we have been given, I knew that thou art a hard man. Well, how is it that a lot of people look at God? And God, as Sister Sue said, God is severe. God is hard. God is tough. Not really. And especially when we consider that when we mess up, when we do fall short, and when we do sin, what's the relationship that we have? He's our Father. All right? Fathers have to discipline their children from time to time. Does that mean they stop loving them? No. You need this time of punishment so as to be able to learn, and then we go on together. And that very thing is going to happen with Abram in this section as well. So there are some that are trying to follow the Bible as to the best that they can. And they've developed this mentality. And it ends up putting them in a position that they are so afraid to make the slightest move lest they do something wrong. I mean, when we think about in the realm of evangelism, what's the one thing that keeps members of the Lord's church from talking to somebody? Oftentimes it comes down to, well, I don't want to make a mistake. Or I don't want to get into a position of discussing something that I don't know. I mean, what's the worst that's going to happen? What's that now? That's right. I mean, okay, you might face a little bit of embarrassment if you get into something that you don't know, but what do you say? Is it not just best to say, I don't know, but let me study that and get back with you? Sure it is. And one of the best teachers that I've had is being kind of pushed out into situations where I've had to go talk to somebody and they end up hitting me with something that I don't know. And guess what? When that happens, it is embarrassing. But I won't let it happen a second time. Even though there's a funny story with that. I've done that on television, actually. Somebody called and they were asking a question about where the passage was, where Jesus says that he's going to separate the sheep from the goats. Well, they caught me off guard on television, so it embarrassed me. And I said, okay, I'm not going to let that happen again. Well, a few years later, somebody else calls in and I was going to reference that passage. And I tell them that story about how I got embarrassed and I'm not going to forget it again. Well, guess what I did? I referenced the wrong chapter. And at this time, Christine and I, we were married, and she texted me while on TV, and she told me, that's the wrong chapter, ding dong. Guess what? I do my best not to forget it anymore. But fear, allowing fear to hold us back from doing things like that. And why? Because we think, well, I don't want to make God upset. God wants you to try. And that comes from, again, stems from that misconception about God. So Abraham is God's friend. We have another example. Here's another example of the capability that man has. Noah is called a righteous man. Perfect. Now here's Abraham. And he's called the friend of God. Just that's the level of nobility that we can reach. Is there any higher position than to be called the friend of God? Aside from being called a child, I don't know that I can think of anything higher. And even especially during the time frame where we find ourselves in this section, moving into this section, when man has lost their way once again. They're scattered out. They're creating their own nations. I mean, Abram is being called out of the Ur of Chaldees. His father was an idolater. And then here's Abram. And he's called God's friend. What a wonderful thing to consider. And so when God needed one man who was willing to demonstrate what it means to follow God and grow in faith, many people, they leave home and country and search for adventure. But yet here's Abraham, and he was willing to make an adventure of faith. And people today, they go out and they do some extraordinary things. What if we live Christianity that way? To go out and live adventurously. To view our responsibilities in that type of light. I mean, the whole concept about, go west, young man. The possibilities that are out there. That's the same thing with Abraham. Go out. Flourish. The possibilities are endless. But as we consider when he goes out, and we'll touch on some of that very quickly right now. Let's look at some of the information actually in the chapter. Genesis chapter 12. Notice the influence that faith has on Abram. And Abram took Sarai, his wife, and Lot, his brother's son. And that is what God intends for faith to do. God intends for faith to act. Here's what I've told you to do, and here's Abram, and he does that very thing. God expected the faith of the Jewish nation to influence the rest of the world, just like Abram's faith is designed to influence us. Now notice this. Notice the confession and worship of faith. Genesis chapter 12, verses 6 and 7. And Abram passed through the land unto the place of Shechem, unto the plain of Moreh, and the Canaanite was then in the land. And the Lord appeared unto Abram and said, Unto thy seed will I give this land. And there builded he an altar unto the Lord, who appeared unto him. As Abram is being called out, what is he continuing to do? Everywhere he goes, everywhere he stops, he's building an altar. Now, can you just imagine if you were there in the land of Canaan and you are established, you're one of these Canaanite people. Now, you would know who these other people are because, as we've said, they're all related. And then here's this guy, Abram, and he's just out here living in tents and building altars. That's a funny way to live. Well, that's how a lot of individuals will look at Christianity. Well, that's a funny way to live. They're not living like the rest of us. Or at least we're not supposed to be. And what is that all about? It's designed to be an influence. Well, what's his deal? Well, don't you know he was called out? Haven't you heard that his God is saying that he's going to give to him this land? Give to him a son, produce out of him a nation? All of those things are going to be being spread. And so, we also have to consider the endurance of faith. Notice verse 8 and 9. And he removed from thence unto a mountain on the east of Bethel, and pitched his tent, having Bethel on the west, and Hai on the east. And there he built an altar unto the Lord, and called upon the name of the Lord. And Abram journeyed, going on still toward the south. This is going to take some patience. And when we're considering the life of a Christian, our life hinges upon endurance. Being able to be patient. I mean, at this juncture, Abram, he has no seed, though he's being promised one. He lived in tents while God promised Abram a land. Now, what's the difficulty that we face? We get in a hurry, do we not? Well, okay, we know these things are supposed to happen. God is supposed to take care of us. So let's see him take care of us. If it happened like that, would it really be worth anything? If everything just happened immediately? No, it's not going to be worth it. It's those long endurance sections that actually make anything of any value. The struggle, being able to overcome. And when Abraham died, what did Abraham die with? How much land did Abraham actually die with? He only died with a small plot of dirt that he paid for. A place for him to bury his wife and himself. But what was Abraham's focus? We know from Hebrews chapter 11, verse 16, but now they desire a better country, that is, an heavenly, wherefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he hath prepared for them a city. Abraham was able to look for something beyond this world. And then we end up seeing the test of faith. And here's where we want to end this evening, because I know the timer's going to get us. Notice Genesis chapter 12 and verse 10. We're discussing the importance of endurance. And there was a famine in the land. Now, y'all, God has called Abram out of his father's house to go into a land that he does not know. And while he is involved in answering the call of God, a famine strikes. Will God take care of him? So here we're seeing Abram's faith has to grow. It has to be tested. Our faith has to grow and it has to be tested. Now just think about this. Here is the land of promise. But there's famine in the land of promise. How many of us would be ready to go back home? Well, this isn't what I thought it was going to be cut out to be. You're calling me to a land of promise, and here we are in a famine. What a strange combination, promise and famine. Just because you're striving to do what God says does not mean that we're going to be exempt from difficulty. Faith gives us the ability to overcome difficulties, not to be exempt from them. And we see that with Abraham, how he grew. All right, there's the buzzer. Any other thoughts or comments as I shut us down? All right. No takers? I appreciate very much your attention, and we'll